So good afternoon. We're beginning with a new series today called Internal Family Systems, IFS. It's one of the most up-and-coming methodologies in psychotherapy these days. It's not a very old model in that sense, although the concepts that it uses are very old. I mean, it's something that we see in various philosophies, especially in a lot of old Vedic literature. You find mention of various what are called aspects of the self, which are documented as internal family members in this particular concept. So the good part about IFS is it's a very simple technique. It's very safe to use by yourself, for yourself. You don't necessarily need to be dependent on a therapist. Hi. While of course, yes, there are therapist certifications and there is a certain process available as well. If you do not wish to work with a therapist, it's equally easy to work by yourself. That there is no medication involved, or that there is no heavy process involved that you cannot do by yourself. So the model was evolved by a person called Dr. Richard Schwartz in the US, and Richard's background was primarily about psychotherapy work with trauma patients. So he would deal with a lot of patients who come from extremely traumatic backgrounds, including war, soldiers who've been hurt, people who've faced a lot of sexual abuse as children and therefore have problems as adults, a lot of people who have suicidal tendencies. So that was his background of work. And the model evolved especially because he realized that people who come from a traumatic past and therefore in the present try and work with or respond to situations in dysfunctional ways. So for example, it could be about people wanting to cut themselves, harm themselves, exposing themselves to very dangerous sexual encounters. And he would wonder, why is it that these people want to do this? Because very often in his sessions with his clients, he would find that the clients have actually agreed to make healthy choices, try and be safe and create safe spaces for themselves. And yet when they would go back home, the abnormal or the destructive behavior would come back again. Over a period of time, as he spoke to these patients, he realized that yes, there was a part of those patients that really wanted to heal, that really wanted to be safe and resourceful, and those were the parts that would talk to him in those therapeutic sessions and commit to recovery. They would commit to healthful behavior. And yet there was also a part of these same people which would not want to commit to that behavior because they had their own reasons. And in the process of understanding how this works internally in the mind of a person who's been exposed to trauma, he realized that all of us have parts within us, right? So, and that doesn't make us abnormal. It's a very normal process of having various parts. So Dr. Schwartz integrated what is called systems thinking or the systems approach into therapy. And so what we call as the IFS model or the internal family systems now is an integrative aspect which incorporates systems thinking into conversations with these parts. Now the assumptions that we make with the IFS model is that we are not one integrated personality. Yes, all of us are individuals, we are persons, but all of us have different personalities within us. At the same time, it doesn't mean we have multiple personality disorder. There is nothing dysfunctional about having parts within us. It's just that sometimes not all of these parts may be aligned with each other, and therefore because they're not aligned with each other, they're not integrated, sometimes one part does not support the decision of another part, and therefore things that we wish to do in life get disrupted. And these disruptions could be in day-to-day lives, in not necessarily in a manner that causes trauma, that causes huge dysfunctions, but it could be something that disrupts our day-to-day ambitions. For example, let's say there is a part of me that really wants to work on losing weight, right, and getting fit, and yet there is also a part of me that every time when I think of exercise says no, not today, right. So one part of me wants to lose weight, and yes, it still wants to lose weight, and yet simultaneously there is that part that says no, I want to rest today, right. So there are these two parts that are not aligned with each other, and because they are not integrated with each other, I am unable to proceed in the process of wanting to lose weight, which could be through yoga, it could be through going for walks, exercise, whatever it could be. Right? Similarly, these parts act up in multiple situations in our lives. It could act up in situations like, let's say, wanting to let's say choose more healthy meals. It could be about stopping smoking. It could be about let's say wanting a career shift and yet not being able to do it. It comes up in various aspects of our lives. So the myth that we break with IFS, the first myth is that we are one personality. No, we are not. We have multiple personalities integrated within us. The second assumption that we make here is no parts are bad. So while there may be a part of me that says no, I don't want to exercise, it's not a bad part. It has good intentions for me. Right? I may judge it as being bad because somewhere it's being dysfunctional for me at a practical level, but it doesn't mean that the part has wrong intentions. It's just trying to safeguard me in its own way, perhaps in a manner that I do not understand yet. Right? And the third and the most important assumption here is that all of us have what Dr. Schwartz termed as the self. Right? Now, the self is this part of us that is whole and complete and integrated. Right? Which means that what we are saying is that while there is a brokenness in us, in the sense parts are not aligned, there is also a wholeness in us simultaneously. And this whole part with this self is the reason why we understand that there are these other parts that are at war. If there was no wholeness in us, we wouldn't understand the brokenness also. So there is an integrated part which he simply calls the self. Now the self has all of these qualities. It is capable of being calm. It has a lot of clarity in the sense it really knows what it wants in life. Right? So this is the part of us that is aware of our life mission, our life purpose. This is the part of us that knows what we want to do next. Right? This is also the part of us that lends curiosity to us, which means it's the part that prods us to learn more. It wants to go talk to people, understand more, have fun, expose ourselves to new areas of knowledge, wisdom. Right? It has a lot of questions and it wants to grow. It's the part of us that promotes growth. This, of course, is also the part of us that allows for creativity. It allows us to experiment with new things, wants to innovate, wants to change things in life. It's also very confident. That the self, because it knows what it wants, is also very confident because it has that conviction that comes from a sense of purpose. Right? So it is confidence, it lends us courage. It's compassionate in the sense it is understanding of all those broken parts which sometimes may not be able to align with each other. It understands, it doesn't reject the part. Some parts may reject each other, but the self by itself doesn't reject any part of it. And it is the part of ourselves which lends what is called connectedness. It facilitates the integration of all the other parts. Right? And the assumption is that all of us, regardless of our past, have the self in us. Different kinds of literature have called this different things. So we call it the seat of consciousness, the spiritual self, the higher self. You could name it anything. But what we are saying is that this is the part of, this is that aspect of ourselves that is whole and complete, and it watches this interplay of dialogues between all these other parts that constantly keeps happening. So the primary idea behind IFS is to work with all these other parts, but use the energy of the self in the process of that dialogue. So what we are trying to do in this series is to look at various modes, concepts and ways of using IFS for therapy. You could use it with oneself, you could use it, you could help somebody else through the process. And the good part with IFS is it easily integrates with various other modes of therapy that you might want to use. It easily integrates with drama therapy, it easily integrates with emotional intelligence and emotional competence if you want to use it together. Any other dialogue based therapeutic tools or writing based therapeutic tools can be easily used with IFS. So the point of today's lecture is just for us to be able to understand the model, and then in the eventual series we will look at various modes that are available. So to continue with what are these paths that we speak about. Now the IFS model proclaims that while there is the self, which is the overarching part which encompasses all other parts, there are three primary categories of parts, so to say. Right? So the first category is the manager. Right? So the manager is that part of us which puts up that social front. It tries to be the so-called adult in terms of behavior. It tries to give rational responses to situations. The second part is that part of us which is in exile. It's that part which we do not allow to come up as much as possible because we think it's unhealthy, it's unpleasant, uncontrollable sometimes. And the third aspect is that of the firefighter. Now this firefighter is constantly trying to make sure that the manager is pushed up front and the exiled part is subdued and is suppressed and it doesn't come forth. Right? So for example, if there is a behavior in me where, okay, let's continue the example of wanting to exercise. So I really want to take up an exercise regime and lose weight. Okay, so every time I think up of a solution to this process of wanting to get fit, the manager part of me would come up and say, yes, I think tomorrow onwards I'm going to start an exercise regime. I wake up at 6 in the morning, go for a walk for an hour. Right? That's the manager part which is trying to get to solutions. Right? Now, the same time when it comes to 6 in the morning tomorrow, there's this part of me which would come up and say, not today, let's start tomorrow, let's start next Monday, let's start the first of next month, right? And there is this part which if I explore further and I understand why is this part wanting to do this, why is this part wanting to sabotage my exercise regime, if I have a dialogue with this part, I might realize that this is really an exiled part of me which wants to rest, and this part perhaps came up long ago in some instance where I really wanted rest, but the situation did not allow me to rest. I was forced to work hard because there was no other option. So it could have come from a situation, let's say, where I might have needed to earn my way through college, and therefore I would make do for 5 years with 3 hours of sleep and then work hard the whole day. And even if I really wanted to rest, the option was only to work hard, right? And because there has been such a bad emotional attachment to this particular part that wants rest, somewhere I have managed to exile it, right? Which means anytime there is, I really want rest, my natural reaction to it is shut up, now is not the time, right? And therefore this part that wants rest is exiled. So the firefighter starts coming up every time this exiled part wants to come up and express itself. So manager says go exercise, exiled part says, really not today. The firefighter comes up and says, okay, I've got to manage the situation. I can't let the exiled part come up and be successful. I can't let the exiled part be successful in the sense of wanting rest. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do something disruptive to make sure the exiled parts keep shut up, and in the process see if the manager can work. And very often, because there's this fight that's going on, the manager will very often not end up working. So the possibility with the firefighter is that, yeah, I'll say, okay, not today, tomorrow, I'll, put the alarm on snooze and sleep for another 15 minutes. But because this firefighter is fighting so hard constantly, the result very often is that I'm not actually able to enjoy those extra 15 minutes or half an hour of sleep, because at some point in time, the manager starts feeling guilty, right? Because the rest is not being allowed. The firefighter is constantly trying to subdue the rest, and in the process makes the manager feel guilty for wanting to exercise but not doing it. So in this process, I do not end up exercising. I do not end up having the rest I want either. And I'm in that in-between state where I'm feeling extremely guilty and bad about myself and beating myself down about the whole situation, just because there is a fight among all these parts. Right? Now the self is that aspect of self which understands this drama that's going on within us. And what IFS methodologies try and do is to initiate a dialogue between these three parts, and there are multiple ways to initiate this dialogue, and we'll explore that as we go along in the series. One of the simple ways that we use is to literally create spatial anchors, which means there is an anchor for self, there is a chair that I designate for the manager in me, for the firefighter in me, for the exile in me, and I go across to each of those spaces and vent out the point of view of that part, given the assumption that each part has its own useful intention. Right? So in the process of that dialogue, I might realize that the useful intention of the manager is, of course, it wants fitness for me, it wants long-term good, it wants me to be healthy so that I can do various things in life, and therefore it would like to push me into an exercise regime. At the same time, the exile part may have its own good intentions. It may be about the fact that, yes, I do need rest, and I may not have acknowledged it in various aspects of my life. Now, it's possible that I may not need physical rest, but I may need rest in some other form. It could be about rest in terms of wanting a break from work mentally. It could be about rest in terms of wanting to be away from a certain situation or a certain person, and therefore free up certain other resources. Right? So the idea behind IFS is to hear out all of these parts using anchors, and then eventually come to an agreement, perhaps even let the parts appreciate each other for the role that they are playing in our lives. And more often than not, with IFS, we realize that no matter what the part is, they're always trying to protect us, although it may not seem that way. Especially the parts that make us overeat or get into substance abuse may not look like they're trying to protect us, but they really are. The intention is very good. It's just that we are not really hearing them the way we ought to. So the model in itself is extremely benign, very simple to work with by ourselves, and you can have fun with the methodologies. So that's what I like most about IFS, that you can be very creative with the way you use IFS for yourself and for others. So to summarize for today, what happens in the IFS methodology is that as we speak to these parts, each of these parts within us, we realize that some of these parts carry what are called burdens. So for example, that part in me that demands rest is carrying a burden of the past where it wasn't allowed rest when it wanted to, and therefore it has a bad emotional equation with that particular situation or area of my life. And the whole point of using the IFS process is to unburden it, which means you acknowledge the importance of the past, tell it how well it has served us, how well it has protected us, and in the process unburden it, which means you give it assurance that yes, you are heard, and that burden that you have been carrying for so long is not really necessary anymore, because we are no longer in the situation in which that part emerged. We have moved on historically, and therefore it's okay for the past, it's okay for that part to drop that baggage where it belongs in the past, and therefore come back into the present in a resourceful state, which means that exiled part is no longer exiled, it comes up into the present, it is heard. So therefore the next time around when I start exercising, when that part speaks up and says, okay, today I'm a little more tired than usual, so I don't want to do half an hour of work, I want to do just 15 minutes, and that can be heard because it's reasonable. It's not trying to say don't exercise, it's just trying to say I'm aware of what's happening to my body, so let's be respectable about it. So once it's unburdened, the part can become very natural. It's very easy for it to assume a healthy role. Right? And of course, the point to note here is that burdens are not intrinsic to any of our parts. We're not born with any burdens. These are things that get carried on as baggage as we move along in life and end up suppressing various emotions. Typically sadness and anger are things that get suppressed, and in the process they carry burdens and they try and subdue other parts, and in the process the fight emerges. So that's IFS. Application wise, there are multiple usages of it. It's used for trauma, it's very well used for relationship therapy, counseling, marital counseling. Works beautifully because a lot of times when there is conflict between partners, there is one part of us talking to another part of that partner, and we are triggering each other because both are hurt parts, and because they are not heard internally, they try and get themselves heard externally, and when that listening doesn't happen, the parts think they are in conflict with each other. So very beautifully used in counseling, couples counseling. Can be very easily used for self-help of various kinds. And an interesting area of work that's emerging with IFS is the inner critic work. All of us have that inner critic in us which constantly keeps saying you're not good enough, you can't do this, you're too old, too young, too fat, too thin. There are all those judgments that we carry about ourselves, and IFS is extremely useful in working with the inner critics. So these are some of the areas that I'd like us to explore as we go along in this series. But for now, the invitation for you is to just go back today and explore which are the parts of you that are alive. You may not necessarily categorize them in the way Dr. Schwartz did, in the sense of manager, firefighter and exile, but sometimes the parts come up as the inner parent, there's an inner child, there's sometimes an inner grandparent, an inner police, an inner mother-in-law. All of those parts live in us, and that's why it's called the internal family systems. There's an entire family that lives within us, and typically all the roles that we have outside of us, we tend to internalize some part of it. Right? So if you've, let's say, grown up with a critical mother, we tend to internalize that mother at some point in time. So while on the outside we may not like that quality about the mother, at some point in time as we grow up, we have actually internalized, imbibed that quality, and even if the mother is not around, we do that job for ourselves, which means we criticize ourselves the way the mother would have. Right? So look at who are the various family members that you have internalized and what's their relationship inside of you. Very often the relationship that is outside of you is also the one that's inside of you. So if there is conflict outside, somewhere the parts are in conflict. And invariably, if you're able to resolve the conflict within, the external relationship will change because you're coming from a different consciousness. You're coming from the space of the self rather than approaching the person from the space of the part so that there's a lot more energy and resource available to you when you deal with that situation outside of you. So do try and explore who lives in your internal family today. All right, so that's that for today. That's Dr. Schwartz's website. He has a center for self-leadership, and the website is selfleadership.org, which contains a lot of resources, videos and articles that you might like to read up about this particular model of IFS. Do we have any questions?